is this idea that if it happens under capitalism, it's the only way that capitalism can work. Have you tried Foxhole? Foxhole is fucking great. But yeah.
YouTubers,
Yeah, I've
when
tried
you
it.
sign up for Curiosity Stream at the link below.
By different devs?
In the United
Are
States.
they? I thought it was the same one. It's Sega, isn't it? Or is it not?
Every politician from the right to the so-called left assumes that the role of society is to create an even playing field for everyone to compete in. Usually, they only disagree on whether or not we're there yet. The idea is that regardless of where you start or how society perceives you, you should have the ability to leverage your talent and your effort to rise to the level you're capable of. Your accomplishments should be the only way by which you are granted status in society. Influence, wealth, prestige, whatever your aspirations. In a meritocracy, the rule is that the only way to get there is by doing something of merit. I don't like that notion, at least not all of it, and I'm gonna spend about 15 minutes on it, so strap in and enjoy the ride. In this episode,
I think everything should strive to be a meritocracy. Like, meritocracies idealized are the best systems that exist by far. What other system are you gonna have? Like, legitimately. Like, you could argue that meritocracies never work out really well. That could be open to. But, meritocracies are absolutely, like, the best system that exists, I think.
we're going to be looking at the way that meritocracy, once a slur
Can
thrown
be
around
pretty
by
cruel to people without merit? No, not intrinsically, no.
socialists, became the dominant
They
ideology
tend
of the
to be,
imperial core
but they don't
and
have
the
to be.
backbone of neoliberal capitalism. We're going to look at the reality of upward mobility in the US and how meritocracy has been used to replace democracy with rule by an elite minority. This video is going to be a sort of part 2 to our previous episode on meritocracy. You don't have to have seen that one to watch this one, but if you'd like to start there, the link is in the description. So, let's start by getting a few things out of the way. As much as some politicians like to say it, we very clearly don't live in a meritocracy. Upward mobility, the idea that you can easily change your life from the circumstances you're born into with hard work or intelligence alone, does not exist. More than just about anything.
Wouldn't that be a tautology? You can easily change your life with hard work. Isn't that a tautology? I forget what it's called. Like it's not how even people would describe people who believe in a meritocracy would describe it. No, it's a contradiction. Oh, it's an oxymoron. I know it has a specific name.
Else, where you start has a massive impact on where you end up. For the majority of millennials and Gen Z, the rule actually seems to be downward mobility. Specifically, the likelihood that a millennial or Gen Z American will attain a higher standard of living than their parents is in the low 40%, meaning well over 50% of people will experience a downward trajectory over the course of their lives. That's a group-based analysis, and at the individual level, things aren't much better. For someone born in the lower quintile of income distribution, the odds that they'll make it into the top quintile is only 10%, half as much as it should be in a meritocracy.
Huh?
Someone born in the lower quintile of income distribution, the odds that they'll make it into the top quintile is only 10%, half as much as it should be in a meritocracy.
Why would that be half as much as it should be? Is it just because it did 20%? Also, that's fucking incredibly high. Yeah, I was gonna say, that's unbelievable. So, like, I remember when people, because this isn't the first time that I've heard this before. People are like, your chance of going from like the bottom percent to the top percent is like at like 10%. I'm like, dude, are you telling me that out of my high school, the bunch of like fucking poor fucks that I went to high school with, that like, I went to high school like 400 people, 500 people or some shit, I think. Maybe more. That fucking 40 or 50 of them are going to be like millionaires? Jesus Christ.
For most people, there's a far greater chance that you'll either remain in the quintile you were born into or the one immediately below or above you, even more so if you aren't straight, white, or a man. In over 50% of cases, the inequality your parents experienced, their social...
Which is kind of weird because for black men, that really isn't the case. Black women are by and large better off than black men, but which is kind of an interesting situation.
Standing is directly passed down to you. And for a country that has branded upward mobility with its name, the American Dream, the US is pretty terrible.
He's saying in purely theoretical terms that people with the lowest quintile should have a 20% shot of distributing into another quintile, 10% at half of that. Yeah, that's... why would that be, like, why would you even make that claim that it should be at that?
At actually guaranteeing it. Among wealthy nations, the US is only 16th in upward mobility, and there's a good chance that number is only going to go down. Unsurprisingly, this...
Well, that's not very surprising as well because we're not a developing country. Developing countries can often provide more of a... they're like laborers with jobs that would enable upward mobility. Like, more readily speaking, I mean... How do you think most Chinese people got their money from literally 70 years ago being a third world country? You know, how did that happen? You know? It's like, I don't know what to say. They literally did like menial labor jobs and then, you know, traded and fucking had some pretty weird arcs, not gonna lie, some weird business go on, but they traded and shit, and yeah, they got a lot of those jobs, and they industrialized. A lot of your capital goes to your people when you start industrializing, when they go from jobs like picking up hay to like working in a factory and then making a fuck ton more money. So
This is the outcome of the United States neoliberal political program. Fans will know I've already spent a lot of time talking about liberalism on this channel. And with my friends, my therapist, and... okay, fine, they're not my friends, they're slightly different kinds of leftist and I hate them. Anyway, if you haven't heard about it before, let's quickly go over liberalism. Liberalism is a word you've probably heard used to describe Democrats, but more accurately, the word applies equally to the two major US parties. In a liberal economy, the role of the state is to not exist, or exist just a tiny bit, and instead give the market the final say on who makes it out alive.
Unbiased.
It's survival of the fittest for companies, ideas, and people. And therefore whatever or whoever is left when the dust settles has earned their place no matter how they got there. To make sure none of the perfection of the market outcomes is perverted, you get pathetically weak safety nets in very liberal states. And because all-out competition is seen as the most legitimate way to decide what is good and what is bad, everything enters this competition and becomes commodified, from healthcare to schooling to basic necessities. Since markets are deemed to be the best at deciding what is good and what is bad, markets come to decide just about everything. Even though you couldn't ask for a more meritocratic system, it turns out this approach leads to a couple of things that don't really jibe with meritocracy. The obvious one is that being poor starts costing a lot more. In liberal markets, the poor are not only disadvantaged because they have less money, but also because money is increasingly needed to buy goods, services, and even opportunities for their children. In a deeply commodified regime, parents are left to purchase high-quality childcare, high-quality primary and secondary schooling, if only by moving into expensive...
This is not necessary, unless we want to start getting into neoliberalism and stuff like this. This isn't necessary for liberalism.
...expensive neighborhoods, and high-quality college training. All of which...
this is something that I really do fucking hate from people. And this isn't exclusively on the left, but people in general. Is this idea that if it happens under capitalism, it's the only way that capitalism can work, right? They ignore the history of capitalism and how much it's changed and how much shit that we have gotten in capitalism and how much it's changed, and it's still capitalism. Like, for instance, when like America was in its developing stages, there was some straight up like fucking ANCAP shit going on. Full monopoly, vertical, horizontal monopolies and shit like that going on. And it's like, well, shit, a lot of these things can no longer happen. A lot of them aren't. We should have more regulations as to how they can happen. But a lot of them don't happen at nearly the rates that they did before because they were legal and people didn't understand what the fuck was going on. There weren't consumer protections as much as there is, right? There's a tremendous amount of regulations that have been put on capitalism that we take for granted that still make it capitalism. And we can keep going. But the problem is like, oh, there's a homeless person right now, therefore it's capitalism. There's no thing that can be changed in capitalism to help homeless people. It's not possible because capitalism exists, homeless exist, therefore capitalism problem, no, it's fundamental, can't change it. Jesus Christ, this is so stupid.
Means that opportunity itself has been commodified. In other words, the logic of markets and the fact that they favor the guy with money in his pocket means that there's no such thing as equal opportunity under supposedly meritocratic liberal regimes. That was a quote from the Poverty and Inequality Report, and it's only the first part of what's going on here. Structural issues like housing segregation, which reached its apex during the redlining era, play into very persistent feedback loops meant to trap people in poverty. Low-quality housing leads to low property taxes, which leads to underfunded schools and worse education than in the unaffordable private sector or in wealthier neighborhoods. Worse education holds people back, lowering incomes down the line and preventing them from getting better housing in neighborhoods with better schools, and you can tell where this is going. With a zip code alone, you can pretty reliably tell where someone will end up down the line. And that is a very clear problem for a country that wants to be a meritocracy. But this is also a problem for meritocracy itself. So long as meritocracy's reward is
modern liberals want government regulation and social programs to promote higher standard of living for lower social strata. Yeah, but it doesn't care because it's shadowboxing.
Differential privilege that you can pass down, meritocracy dies in just a single generation. The problem with meritocracy is that if you play the game, you ruin it for everyone that comes after you. Imagine you use your big boy brain to make drinking water illegal unless it's from your premium service. Your kids will be far better off than the average person without ever having had that brilliant idea. The challenge for meritocracy is that it is incompatible with the economic system that champions it. But how did we even get to that point? The truth is that meritocracy...
So this is an issue that I had a discussion with Vivian about, because this would be true of all things when it comes to social creation. So how would inheritance work under socialism? And if there is no inheritance under socialism, that's completely fucked. So what you're telling me is I worked really hard to be able to afford a house, and then as soon as I die, my kids get kicked out of my house? Like, they get kicked out? They can't live in my house anymore? Because it was, well, listen, that was your house, and you can't pass it down to them because they didn't work for the house. So they have to get evicted. Fuck? Why? Like, and then there was so much fucking shit. And then it's like, okay, well, what if you don't own a house? What if it's not private property? It's like, okay, I buy an iPhone, or I get an iPhone. Can I hand my iPhone down to my kids? And then they were like, no, you can't it's inheritance. You can't hand your iPhone down to your kids. Like, okay, then what if I give as a gift my iPhone to my kid? Can I not give the gift of my iPhone to my kid? And then it gets really fucking complicated from there, because then if your answer is no, you cannot, like, what do I get my kid for their birthday? Social credit points? Bing chilling? Like, are you joking?
Upward mobility, whatever you want to call it, is a relatively new cultural obsession. There is evidence that the idea of an aristocracy of talent dates back to the French and American revolutions. But the actual word meritocracy only appeared for the first time in the left-wing journal Socialist Commentary in an article by Alan Fox back in 1956. Needless to say, Fox doesn't love
You're only allowed to gift within a certain amount, or you have to report it to tax? Well, no, that's how everyone works. That's how everything works, even in America. You can only have a certain amount of gifts before you have to report it to tax. That's a tax, though, right? We're talking about inheritance in general, right? Whether or not you can inherit something. Because if the argument is you should have a higher inheritance tax, that could work.
Term he seems to have come up with, putting it in sarcastic quotes and dropping lines like, "This way lies the meritocracy, the society in which the gifted, the smart, the energetic, the ambitious, and the ruthless are carefully sifted out and helped towards their destined positions of dominance, where they proceed not only to enjoy the fulfillment of exercising their natural endowments, but also to receive a fat bonus thrown in for good measure." For Fox, and eventually Michael Young, a writer who would pick up and popularize the term 2 years later with his dystopian novel The Rise of the Meritocracy, meritocracy has only ever been one thing: a way for the elite to reproduce their class, to set the rules of the game in a favorable way to their own privileges, and then to coat them in enough positive morality to make it seem like an inherently good way to structure our society. But this doesn't happen naturally. It turns out it's really hard to convince people that what they want is a system where if they're not smart enough by the system's standards, that they're not deserving of the safety and luxury of the few at the top. So
Yeah, like, legitimately, why, unironically, why would so even in a communist or socialist system this would be true, why would somebody who has tremendous social utility or pragmatic utility in general have the same living standard as somebody like me who has very little social utility or pragmatic utility? Like a random Twitch streamer sitting in his room, Twitch streaming, why would I be given the same luxuries as somebody who's like making breakthroughs on the coronavirus vaccine? I shouldn't. Like, legitimately, I should not. So I don't, the argument that like, who wants to live in an environment where in which that's the case? Me. I'm fine with that. As long as my bottom end luxuries are like decent standards of living, I'm cool with that. Yeah, why not? The person who went to school for 8 years and then is actively studying at the apex of, what is it? I forget what the fucking name of the, is it virology? Like study of viruses? Studying at the apex of that shit is gonna get fat bonuses.
Same way that a Pepsi
is it epidemiology?
Ad sells you a fizzy brown drink with footage of a made-up protest, liberation movements of the 60s were entirely co-opted by the emergent neoliberal capitalist regime. Real anger and demands for change were brought into the fold of the economy that produced them in a series of subtle reforms by social democratic and third-way politicians in the UK and the US, who came to embrace terms like meritocracy while completely ignoring their origins as dystopian vocabulary. It's like if 25 years from now, the Democratic candidate was the pro-Hunger Games guy, because when you think about it, isn't a lottery-based battle royale actually a very meritocratic way to decide who gets food? The result of these political movements is that instead of addressing the structural inequalities faced and resisted by women, racial minorities, members of the LGBT community, and the poor, the new narrative became that it is success within the rat race, not its abolition, that is revolutionary. Of course, that never materialized, and marginalized people are mostly still kept down across the board. But the belief that there is some broad equality of opportunity has persisted. The few who do, quote-unquote, make it from the last remaining unequal starting lines are put in the spotlight and turned into symbols of social progress to shame the many more who never do. So, concretely, what do you get from meritocracy? Evidently not upward mobility, nothing resembling social equality in the least, but most of all, you get entitlement for those who do succeed. And entitlement at the top breeds many things, not least of all a conservative view that the status quo is justified. In that sense, meritocracy, and the very real belief in it, acts as a great way to pacify any movement for social change, to reject any form of redistribution of wealth, to deny the fact that structural factors, or even simple luck, can result in dramatic differences in outcome. Those who are given outsized power are the very same who have benefited from things staying exactly as they are, creating a deeply conservative logic within a movement meant to be the progressive alternative to hereditary privilege. The common good goes out the window. Taken to its extreme, a meritocratic regime raises questions among those at the top, like, why bother with democratic dialogue if order has already been achieved in such a just and fair way? Figures on the right jump on these narratives to justify their own power and the repression of democracy. People like Musk, Bezos, and their billionaire buddies are glorified by hordes of weird nerds who come to distrust the average person, who hasn't achieved nearly as much as their heroes. Grifters like Gary Vee and his cohort of inspirational entrepreneurs sell these narratives and contrast them with those coming from the left, making it seem like any structural analysis of injustice is jealous SJWs whining that they aren't as brilliant and hardworking as they are, not as willing to spend a supposed 18-hour day rising and grinding like a true Sigma. In short, these libs just don't know how to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They're just playing the victim card. And this is all because while meritocracy gives a theoretical right to everyone to achieve their full potential, it only gives access to that right to a minority, usually already selected from the elite. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with the idea that society should support and actively incentivize the development of people's skills and interests, both for the benefit of individual people and society at large. The little differences that make us unique, bring us joy, and allow us to improve ourselves, our communities, and the world should be things we cultivate. What is wrong is the ocracy part of meritocracy. The idea that these differences should justify an upper class to form around these attributes. The idea that some enlightened elite should decide for the majority with no accountability is profound.
What an incredibly biased way of looking at it, that everybody that agrees with some form of a meritocracy would think this way. So meritocracy, let me turn it on its head. If you don't believe in a meritocracy, you don't believe in the availability to have doctors have say over the average individual, because they have merit and they have authority based on that merit, therefore a meritocracy. They have the merit in their field. It's similar to the reason why it's not theocracy. I forget what the one is, the one where they have a few like leaders instead of democracy. It's like where they have like a couple leaders or whatever, a technocracy. Similar, like how a technocracy is a form of meritocracy. It's built off of a form of meritocracy. You would disagree with that? It's like this weird misrepresentation of the ideas of this is really stupid. Okay. I think there are certain things that, like, absolutely, your merit should warrant greater appraisal from the state, greater appraisal from general peers, and financial standings as well. I have no issue with this. And, of course, that will come with some measure of ocracy, some measure of people believing these things or have greater effect in the world. And they should have greater effect in the world. They have the ability to provide more for more of a more common resource, right? I am just more concerned with, playing video games.
Undemocratic. And we've seen how even small concessions to meritocracy lead to anything but a fair society. It is time to give up on the idea that it's all about equality of opportunity. The more we can instead democratize our economy and give everyone an equal say in the decisions that affect
Imagine being against equality of opportunity.
us all, the more easily we can escape the unjust social structure we have been sold as the ticket to our salvation. If you enjoyed this week's topic,